what on earth is a government-funded body like Relationships Australia in Western Australia doing, firing one of their most experienced male counsellors for posting my article on domestic violence on his private Facebook page? I'm here today with that poor young man, my friend Rob Tiller, who's visiting from Perth after finding himself out of a job because of promoting my article, from talking about my article on his Facebook page. Welcome, Rob.
Well, thank you, Bettina. Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry you're here in such dire circumstances.
Me too, but it's nice to see you.
That's good. And what we're doing today, I want to tell you a story, but also get people involved in what is an outrageous act by, this body, this Relationships Australia, which openly promotes proudly promotes their feminist ideology in relation to domestic violence on their website, and then they turn around and fire you. Now, Rob, you've been with Relationships Australia for almost a decade. You were very valued by your colleagues, the people you worked with, in terms of being able to present a male perspective on what's going on there. And you got a pay rise last year. Every indication was you were doing really well. And what you did on your private Facebook page was post an article I wrote last year, or the year before I think it was, about domestic violence. Now tell me what happened then.
Yeah, so basically, the reason I posted it is because the work I do with my clients in a way validates what you were saying. You
see men and women who have conflicted relationships who are both violent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe not necessarily always violent, but where there's high levels of conflict, it's generally from both sides, and then I have to, I guess, tailor my treatment to address both sides of the fence.
And that's, the domestic violence policy promoted by your organisation essentially is arguing, there are barely any male perpetrators, it's almost all one way, males are the dangerous ones, the males are the ones who batter their partners.
Absolutely, that it's generally, what's the 3 Ps, the perpetrator, the problem, and the patriarchy.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, and so you knew that you've had to work within that framework.
Yeah,
how that played out in your normal practice, seeing counsellors, seeing clients.
Yeah, well, with my clients, it's. I've always taken an interest in working with men. It's been one of my focus, and I've come to understand a lot of times that men, when they are, acting out in angry ways, or they're expressing themselves aggressively, that's generally a bit of a cry for help from their end. I'm not, of course, I'm not promoting or validating any kind of violence. I call that out when I see it. But generally, in terms of the normal kind of couples issues that I'm dealing with, it's a two-way street. And so there's a process of saying, hey mate, there's some things I'm hearing from your end. There's some ways you're expressing yourself. There's some ways you're behaving that you need to work on. And I address the female side as well, which can often be a bit more subtle, maybe more passive-aggressive, but equally as destructive.
Yeah, and of course, if we're talking about domestic violence now, including emotional abuse and psychological abuse.
Well, they keep expanding the definition.
And we're the past masters of that. Women are very good at pressing male buttons. And if we're talking about domestic violence in terms of that broad definition, there's no question that women are right in there in terms of abusing men, and I'm sure you see that all the time. But anyway,
absolutely.
That's essentially what I was saying in my article. I had all the latest Australian statistics showing that at least a third of male victims of domestic violence are male, and that's when you ask men, are they victims? A lot of men won't admit to that, of course. No. And I talked about the 40 years of international research showing that if you ask people who's actually perpetrated violence, you get just as many women as men acknowledging they do that.
Well, it was an enlightening article.
Yeah.
For me, and it really validated my observations that I've from 10 years of professional work.
Yeah. And you put that up on my article on your Facebook page.
Yeah, and celebrating it.
Yeah.
It's like, hey guys, you know, finally.
Finally, yeah. Well, and what happened, what I think is really shocking is you were part of a loose men's network where you'd exchange... Professional men's network where you'd exchange ideas and talk about issues. And one of those men, who's got a PhD in gender studies, surprise, surprise, took it upon himself to dob you in to your organisation. He took...
To the executives.
To the executives in the organisation. He got the copies of the...
Screenshots.
Screenshots of the email exchange and sent them in to one of your managers. I mean, I just think that is extraordinary.
Well, it was a huge betrayal.
Yeah.
Because in the men's group, you know, we discuss current issues that men are dealing with, that we see in the different areas of, you know, because you have different men from different areas of service provision, you know, Lifeline, Anglicare, for example.
Yeah.
And professional organizations, we all work with men, and so we nut these issues out.
And talk about them, yeah. Anyway, so then you get called into a meeting. Tell me about that meeting.
Well, so my manager, I had a sense that it was, well, her sense was it was going to be a reprimand.
Yeah.
And so she basically said, keep your head down and, you know, just get on with your work. And so I'm going into this meeting thinking, well, I might have to argue my case, and they might even, you know, put a, I don't know, a tag on my HR file.
Sure.
But about 45 minutes into the meeting, I got clear that they were going to terminate me.
Yeah. And they actually forced you to resign.
They did.
Yeah.
They said, yeah, we'll either fire you or you can resign.
Yeah, and in terms of your future career, that seemed the better course to resign.
Well, I just felt blindsided,
yeah.
And I was in shock, and I thought, well, okay.
And I gather most of your colleagues are really appalled by this.
I've gotten so much support. I got so many texts, phone calls of saying, we can't believe this.
Yeah.
What happened?
And they are protesting to the executives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've heard that they've, you know, some of them have yeah, gone to bat on my behalf.
Yeah. And I mean, the way they treated you, that you've been working in this organisation for a decade, you've got clients you've been seeing for 4 or 5 years. They didn't even let you contact those clients to tell them what had happened.
I mean, and that was the hardest part for me, because
yeah.
I've been working, some of my clients are quite vulnerable, highly traumatized histories, and there wasn't an opportunity to even have therapeutic closure with them. Say, I won't be working here anymore, but I recommend you go and see this person. So yeah. it was sloppy.
Yeah, very sloppy. And it just anyway. So we're working on you've put in an unfair dismissal claim. We're discussing legal options. But the advice is, I mean, that may or may not lead on to anything. But in terms of your future, what I'm very keen to do is help you recreate your career. I feel somewhat responsible for all of this. So I'm going to be leading this campaign to rescue Rob Tiller, to give you a new lease of life in terms of your career. So, and I want all my people who are constantly writing to me saying, what can I do, to get on board this one. So we're going to talk a bit about that. But I just want to quickly go back to say...
Well, bless you, Tina.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Well, I hope we can do something. And but I'll go into that in a minute, but I just want to explain a little bit about how I know Rob. It was quite a while back. I was speaking in Western Australia when my book came out on sexual desire, and Rob, and I was speaking at the uni actually, at Western Australia, and he got up and
it was a big crowd.
Big crowd. It was very brave as a young male talking about what it's like to deal with sexual rejection and you know, how many men struggle with that. You'd already been doing workshops around that sort of issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we then met and have had this dialogue ever since. We had great fun. One year I was doing a blog on Wendy Harmer. Wendy Harmer's a well-known Australian comedian.
Hoopla.
It was called The Hoopla, and we did a blog, a male-female blog, advising 3 women who were starting online dating, and you gave the male perspective and I gave the female perspective.
That was so much fun.
Yeah,
that was one of my highlights.
It was a whole year we did that. But ever since we've had communication, because I've been sending you clients, and that's the interesting thing for
to my private practice.
Yeah, to your private practice. But I have a lot of men, particularly, coming to me saying they've been to Relationships Australia, they've been to counselling organisation, and it always ends up feeling to them as if the female counsellor, it's usually a female counsellor, is ganging up against them, is not interested in the male perspective. And you'll be one of the few people I've had in the whole of Australia who I know I can send people to for counselling who will listen to the male perspective and will hear it and will help the women, if it's a couple, to understand what's going on in his head. And I just think that's so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I refer to it translating. I translate the male perspective to the female and vice versa. And there's, I forget who did the research, but in a nutshell, men and women equally suck at relating with each other.
Yeah.
And so that's been my observation, and I guess, what I was saying to you the other day, I've spent quite a bit of time training specifically in how to, number one, validate a female partner's experience, but also challenge them in terms of, well, hey, there's some behaviors coming from your end that aren't helping your relationship.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of my specialties, really.
Yeah.
And I have to even be careful about how I talk about that in group supervision, because there's this idea that, well, if something's going wrong in the relationship, it's probably, guess who?
His fault. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the sexual stuff where so many men will say, well, agree to go to counselling because they want the fact that they're really struggling with sexual rejection to be heard, and they end up talking about housework because the counsellor is aligned with her, listens to her concerns. If he did more around the house, I would be more interested in going to bed, which we know rarely is actually
and sometimes there's an element of, phew, we can talk about housework, which means we don't have to have the tough conversation.
And Rob and I have also, Rob is also a rare breed in that he's a counsellor who's interested in sex and knows something about sex. There's a famous man who many people will know, David Schnarch, I never know how
Schnarch, yeah.
Who wrote a book called Passionate Marriage, amongst other books, but he was really famous for that book, Passionate Marriage. And he's very interesting because he talks a lot about sex, and he's very interested in not just fixing sexual problems as a therapist, but
taking it to the next.
What makes sex great? He asked that question, and there's a wonderful essay he wrote where he talked about asking a room full of counsellors at a conference and therapists at a conference about who's ever had great sex, and he sees some light bulbs across the room with people who clearly know what he's talking about, and the rest is just sort of blank, because of course counsellors are taught nothing about sex. They don't have very little training in even fixing sexual problems, let alone in the whole business of what takes it to that next level. And so Rob's been running, which was always interested in me, you've been running workshops on that sort of issue, and you've done things I would never dare do. Go to tantric sex workshops, go to really, stuff to explore what is it that makes sex wonderful. And I think so that's why I've sent some
stratospheric sex.
I get all these letters from people, right? Everyone who's really into sex or is struggling with sex has all over the years contacted me, and I've never known where to refer them. And you've had some of my people turn up who are really exploring this issue and doing some sometimes crazy stuff, but they've always been able to come to talk to you. And the fact that so that's another sort of territory we've always discussed. So there's a whole range of issues, and we're going to do a whole separate video on some of the areas that Rob and I have always had in common. And what I think is really valuable about the work you've been doing And that's why, of course, many of your colleagues are so upset that they've lost that male perspective in that organisation. And
I mean,
many of the women
that's basically exactly what they've said.
Yeah, and the women are really have valued that. Someone to say, hang on, you're not listening to what the men are saying here, you know. Okay, but we want to talk just briefly now about what I'm proposing to do. We're going to start a crowdfunder. I'm very worried about your loss of income for a start. And we'll do a crowdfunder that we'll put on Rob's webs. I'm going to put Rob's details in the below the video here in the low bar, and my Facebook page will my website. We're going to have full. I'm going to do a whole new page. Scott, are you listening to this? We're going to do a whole new page for my website devoted to the dismissal. Australians will know what that reference is all about. When one of our prime ministers was fired for his job, he called it the dismissal, and he said people had to maintain their rage. Well, this is exactly the same thing. This is the latest dismissal, and we're going to have all the details about how people can contribute to our campaign around Rob Tiller's wrongful dismissal. So we'll be doing a crowdfunder. We're going to have all the details so that people can write letters to this organisation saying, what in the hell are you doing? How can you accept government money and promote a view of domestic violence that is only followed by a tiny sector of our population, the people who think of themselves as feminists? How does that come to govern the way we rule on this particular really important social issue?
Because that was the issue, is they said you breached our domestic violence policy by circulating Bettina's article. Yeah. Because Bettina's article doesn't line up with our domestic violence, our
ideology.
And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, they're promoting ideology. My article included the real statistics from our Bureau of Statistics, from the proper research, and they are choosing to ignore that. A lot of the world is moving on from that.
Even New South Wales.
New South Wales is doing
Relationships Australia.
Relationships Australia and New South Wales is running programs for male victims. And some of the other states are, much more open
progressive
in their policy, acknowledging that there are male and female violence. Victoria's another state which is
similar to WA.
Captured by ideology. Anyway, what I'm also going to be doing is working out ways of helping you re-establish your private practice, and particularly also workshops. I mean, you've done a lot of government or corporate-based
professional development.
Professional development. Tell me about the sort of subjects you've included in that.
So with the professional development, I'll go to a government or corporate agency and run a day-long workshop. For example, dealing with difficult people. That might be clients, that might be other colleagues, or
maybe managers of relationships. I've been saying to Rob, actually, I think he should be doing some workshops on, living in a post-Me Too world. How do you run a workplace? Not just how do we encourage more women to make complaints, but how do males survive in this post-Me Too world? And I think there's real scope for corporate workshops in that area.
Absolutely. In terms of just, men kind of being real clear about the boundaries and how they move around the workplace.
But you've had a lot of experience in that area. We can show people references from corporations you've worked for running that sort of workshops. And maybe there are people watching this who have an organisation where they could benefit from your services.
That'd be great.
So it's all going to happen, and we're going to do another discussion now about another video about some of the other areas where you have real expertise, so people can get to know the real Rob Tiller and decide to passionately support you.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Yeah.
Okay, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah.